Thank you, Rajalakshmi, and good afternoon, everybody. So, we are starting with one of the most common symptom, not only in palliative care, but in general practice, we do see a lot of patients complaining of pain. And many a times, uh, many may neglect it, or the treatment may not be proper. And there are many things which we need to understand for um, treating the pain. Uh, Rather than seeing pain as a symptom, it actually, by treating pain, we are not only treating the pain. Our aim should be to um, actually making the person better and helping him to go to the previous status of his mobility, working, etc. So we will start with an introduction to pain, which will be handled by Dr. Mary Abraham. So, Madam is a retired professor of anesthesia, and she was working as a neuroanesthetist. Then after her retirement, she started not started she was working mainly in the pain management, and later she understood, okay, it is better to do some palliative care along with pain management. So now she is actually doing palliative care. So she will be handling this session. So it's over to you, madam.
Thank you, Sunil. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you, Sunil, for a very warm introduction. And Rajalakshmi, nice to see you again. Okay. And so I'll be talking about the WHO step 1 and 2, right?
Yes,
and
ma'am.
neuropathic pain. That is what I.
Yes, ma'am.
Because Sunil was mentioning introduction to pain.
Yeah. It's, sorry, that was an introduction. Sorry, WHO ladder, step 1 and step 2. Yeah.
Shall I have the first slide, please? So there are around 43 participants, right? Okay, and all of them are doctors. All of you all are doctors.
Yes,
working in palliative care, right?
Not all are working in palliative care, but some of them are exposed to palliative care.
And now they are interested in palliative care. That is why they are part of this program,
yeah.
Right? Okay, yes, that is nice. So can I have the first slide, please? Okay, I'll be talking about pain management. And I have a special interest in chronic pain and in cancer pain. Next, please. So the broad outline of my talk will be, I'll first talk about the basics of the WHO analgesic ladder, and then I will discuss the step 1 and step 2 drugs, along with the adjuvant drugs. And lastly, I will focus a little bit on neuropathic pain. Okay, so first slide, the WHO analgesic ladder. Now, the WHO analgesic ladder was formulated way back in 1986, more than 30 years ago. And this was based on the recommendations of a group of international experts who got together and felt that pain, particularly cancer pain, is being undertreated and people are suffering and dying of pain. So they wanted to devise a way in which this can be now made in a very simple way, a stepwise way, a sort of a protocolized way, in other words, so that it can reach to all parts of the world and such and really palliate and be of use in patients with cancer pain. And accordingly, it was translated into 22 languages. And for the past more than 30 years, it has been very effective in treating cancer pain worldwide. Next, please. So what is this tool? It is a very simple tool, well validated. That means it has been found to be effective in treating cancer pain if you use it in the proper way. So it is basically a stepwise approach to treat cancer pain depending on the severity or the intensity of pain. And like I said, before this, people were dying in unnecessary pain. Why? Because, first of all, there were a lot of drug regulations with opioids. Giving opioids was stigmatized. People who were taking it were stigmatized, and the physicians were very cautious to prescribe opioids because of the stigma and because of the rules, the regulations attached to prescribing opioids. So because of that, people were dying with a lot of pain because the severe pain could not be treated with other analgesics. So this stepwise step ladder actually legitimized the use of opioids because opioids is a step 3 of the ladder. And when the WHO has endorsed it, that means you can go ahead and give it, right? Okay. Next, please. So before we apply the ladder, we must learn to assess the pain properly. So when you assess pain, one thing you need to do is the pain nociceptive or neuropathic? Now, I suppose this has been dealt with in the earlier talks, so I won't go into in detail. The second thing you need to know is what is the intensity of pain, because it is depending on the intensity how you apply the ladder. Is the intensity mild, moderate, or severe? Or if you look at some of the scales that are devised to measure the intensity of pain, they are the unidimensional scales like visual analog scale or the numerical rating score. So using this, you can assess the severity of pain and then apply the ladder accordingly. Next, please. Now, if you come to the ladder per se, you have a step 3. It's a 3-step ladder, the original ladder. Okay. Later on, it was made step 4 step, but I'll talk about that later. So in the step 1, which is for the mild pain. Okay. So in this, the drug you give will be a non-opioid analgesic with or without adjuvant, depending upon whether there are any other types of symptoms along with pain. Okay. And if it's mild pain, it is generally response to these the step 1 drugs. But if it is not responding, and if it is a moderate pain, then you go to the step 2, which is you add to this, you add a weak opioid. So a weak opioid plus non-opioid plus adjuvant. Now, if the pain is still persisting, or sometimes if the pain is very severe, you can straight away go skip step 2 and go to step 3. Now, step 3 is a strong opioid with a non-opioid drug with or without an adjuvant. Okay, it's so simple, this tool. If you apply it in the proper way, it is a very, very simple way of implementing the ladder. Next, please. Now, using this ladder, the 3-step ladder, up to 75 to 76% of patients with cancer can get satisfactory pain relief. So that's a huge chunk, which leaves around 10 to 15 or 20% left only. Most of them can be treated just using this analgesic ladder. Okay, next, please. Now, what are the salient features of the ladder? Since this is a very basic tool that all pain physicians and palliative care doctors need to know, we need to know the salient features of the ladder. The 3 very, very important salient feature is, and then there are 3 more, but first the important 3 ones are, it is given by mouth, by the ladder, and by the clock. Now, what do we mean by mouth? By mouth means the oral route is a standard route for giving all these drugs, including the strong opioids. There's no need of IM or IV or a subcutaneous route. This means that the patient or the caregiver can take it themselves if they understand about the drug and how it is to be given, or a nurse who's visiting them can administer them. So it is very, very well suited for domiciliary care or home-based cancer care, palliative care. Okay, so that is a very big advantage of the ladder. The second is it is given by the ladder. By the ladder means there are 3 steps. So you start with step 1, step 2, and step 3. Very rarely you have to go straight away to step 3. Mostly you can start with step 1, step 2, and step 3. Okay. And the other feature, very important feature, it's given by the clock. By the clock means the timing of the drug is as per the duration of action of the drug. So, for example, you take morphine. We know that the duration of action of morphine is 4 hours. So if you're giving at 6 o'clock in the morning, the next dose is given at 10 o'clock, then at 2 o'clock, then at 6 o'clock, and then at 10 o'clock. So this has to be explained in detail to the patient. It's not that when the pain comes back, then you give the drug. So that means there will be a breakthrough pain. You are not allowing that to happen. If you give it according to the duration of action of the drug, you will not allow the breakthrough pain to happen. So there is a continuous 24-hour control of pain. Okay. The next, another important feature of the ladder is it is individualized to the patient. That means for a patient, the right dose is the one that is relieving the pain. It can vary from one patient to the other. For example, you have an 85-year-old patient. He may get relief, complete relief with 30 milligrams morphine, whereas you have a young man who's 35 years old with severe pain, you may have to give up to 300 mg morphine. So it is very much individualized to the patient. And it's only depending upon the pain of the patient. If the pain is relieved, that is the right dose of the drug, provided the other side effects are not there. And by doing this, you can achieve good control of the pain. And we should also explain that if in this duration of 4 hours, if the pain is recurring, that is a breakthrough pain occurs, then what should we do? All that will be explained in detail to you. So in other words, it is individualized to the patient. So we can explain all the details of how you have to give the drug to the patient. Then another feature of the ladder, have you noticed, is that at every step we have an adjuvant drug also. Adjuvant drug is given for the other associated symptoms along with pain. It could be a neuropathic pain, it could be a abdominal pain, spasmodic pain, it could be pain due to spasticity. So depending on what it is, you have to add an adjuvant drug at every step of the ladder. You may not use it, but you can use it. And the last is attention to detail. That's very important when you're giving these analgesics drugs. You have to see the patient's age, young neonate or a young girl or an elderly man, the habitus of the patient, what is the body weight of the patient, is the patient 30 kg or 50 kg, or are there any other comorbidities, renal problems, hypertension, cardiac problems, or any other thing. So all this has to be monitored individually for that particular patient, and the side effects should be also monitored very specifically. So that is a very important part of this administering drugs according to this ladder. Next, please. So what are the advantages? Why has this ladder stood the test of time? That means even after 35 years, it is still being implemented all over the world. It is because, first of all, it's simple, easy to understand. It is a very validated tool. That is, it is not only effective, but it is cost effective, because most of the drugs that you're giving are very, very inexpensive drugs. So it easily can reach the poorest of the poor people. It can be implemented across the world in so many languages, 22 languages, even in underdeveloped countries. It is well suited for home care because I said most of the drugs can be given by the caregiver of the patient also. And it's not only for cancer pain, but you can give it for non-cancer pain and even for acute pain like a fracture or a post-operative pain, also it can be applied. So it has got a lot of advantages. And next, please. But there are some modifications in the ladder. Sometimes if the pain is very severe, you don't go to step 1 and then step 2 and step 3. The patient will be suffering from so much pain. So directly from step 1, you can go to step 3 also if the pain is very severe. Then a 4th step has been added to treat pain crisis or refractory pain or intractable cancer pain. I'll talk about it in my next slide. Next, please. Next, please. So in 2000, when they felt that there were still a lot of patients, like 20, 25 patients who are not getting relieved with the 3-step ladder, they made the 4th step to the ladder. And what is the 4th step? That is, you may have to give a nerve block. Like, for example, if the pain is in the leg, you may have to give a sciatic nerve block or a femoral nerve block, or you may have to give a brachial plexus block, or you may have to give an epidural injection, or a patient-controlled analgesic pump, PCA pump, or maybe if it is a pancreatic cancer not responding to even the step 3 drugs, you may have to give a celiac plexus block. In worst case scenarios, you use an intrathecal pump, like morphine given implanted intrathecally and given as a direct infusion into the subarachnoid space, or a spinal cord stimulator. So those are advanced pain interventions. Okay, so these can be given in selected patients who are not responding to the 3-step ladder. So that is the 4th step that was done to the ladder. Okay, next please. Now let's discuss step 1 drugs. Step 1 drugs are the non-opioid drugs. They include paracetamol, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which may be combined with an adjuvant drug. Next, please. So paracetamol is also called acetaminophen in the US. It acts centrally. It inhibits the enzyme cyclooxygenase in the central nervous system. It does not have any effect on the peripheral cyclooxygenase enzyme, unlike in NSAIDs. So its action is predominantly antipyretic and analgesic with no anti-inflammatory action. Okay, please remember that. Next, please. So what are the doses? I don't have to go in so much detail because all of you are familiar how to give paracetamol. Suffice to say that the daily dose should not increase 4 grams and a single dose should not increase 1 gram. The normal dose is 650 mg every 6 hours because the duration of action of paracetamol is only for 6 hours. It has a potential for hepatotoxicity, but if it is given cautiously, in restricted dose, you can give it in patients even with liver disease. Safe for pediatric use, up to 15 mg per kg every 6 hours. Toxicity occurs in doses over 90 mg per kg per day. The numbers to need NNT, it's a numbers needed to treat for paracetamol is 5. 5 means for every 5 patients given paracetamol, 1 patient will have more than 50% pain relief. So if this NNT is low, that means the drug is a very good analgesic. If it is high, it is not that effective. So if you compare this to Brufen, definitely the NNT is higher as compared to Brufen. Okay. Now it can also be given by the rectal route, but that is only when the oral route is not suitable. For example, a patient with oral cancer unable to swallow, then you can give it by rectum also. Next, please. The advantages of paracetamol. Why is it so useful given at every step of the ladder? That is because its safety profile is very good as compared to the NSAIDs. It has no adverse effect on gastric mucosa. It has no adverse renal effects, no effect on platelet function. It is even tolerated by those who have allergy and who are hypersensitive to the NSAIDs. And it also does not affect the plasma uric acid level, which means even in patients with gout, you can give it. Next, please. So, like I said, there is a drawback also, that is that it has to be given every 6 hours. And there is a potential for hepatotoxicity, but that's only when you give it in high doses. Those with impaired renal dysfunction, impaired liver function, you give it at a lower dose. Those who are taking alcohol, use it carefully. If the body weight is less than 50 kg, then you restrict the dose to only 2 grams per day. That is 500 mg QID. Next, please. So, like I said, it's because of its safety profile and its opioid sparing effect. It is a very useful drug to give. And when you add it with NSAIDs, it can be combined at every step of the ladder. It can be combined with the first step with NSAIDs. It can be combined with step 2 like Tramadol. It can even be combined with opioids. And so that is why it is a very useful drug to give in cancer. Next, please. Now coming to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or NSAIDs. Next, please. Now, this NSAIDs acts by its inhibiting the enzyme peripheral cyclooxygenase. Now, this is a very important step in the arachidonic acid cascade, which ultimately produces the tissue and inflammatory prostaglandins. Now, when tissue injury occurs, then there are phospholipids are released, and that is converted into arachidonic acid, which is acted upon by the cyclooxygenase enzyme and then converted into prostaglandins, which is causing the inflammatory effect and the pain. So these are the mediators, the inflammatory mediators for pain. Okay. Now, prostaglandins, when it is released, it acts by peripheral sensitization. That means it amplifies the pain impulse. And this is especially seen in nociceptive pain associated with inflammation. Next, please. So if you look at this cascade that is given here, tissue injury releases phospholipids, which releases arachidonic acid, which is acted upon by this COX enzyme, COX-2 enzyme, and it converts into prostaglandins, which produces the inflammation. So, but on the other hand, there is another enzyme called COX-1. Okay, COX-1 enzyme. Can I have the full screen? Now, the COX-1 enzyme, as compared to COX-2, it is actually important for our body functions. Like it is subserving the homeostatic functions in our body related to the stomach, the kidney, the platelet function. So ideally, this should not be inhibited because these are beneficial enzymes. The one that should be inhibited is the one that is mediating inflammation, which is the COX-2 enzyme should be inhibited. So if you look at the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, there are selective and non-selective NSAIDs. The non-selective NSAIDs is inhibiting both COX-1 and COX-2, whereas the selective NSAIDs is inhibiting only COX-2. So that means only the undesirable effect of inflammation is getting inhibited and not the desirable functions like the stomach, the kidney, the platelets, etc. are not inhibited with selective COX-2 enzyme. Next, please. So this is what I said, the non-selective and selective. Okay, non-selective interferes with both COX-1 and COX-2, and selective is interfering only with COX-2. Next, please. So let us talk about the non-selective NSAIDs. The commonly used drugs are ibuprofen, naproxen, and aspirin. So because of its inhibiting the beneficial enzyme, that is a COX-1, you have all these side effects, like the GI side effect, the hypersensitivity reactions like angioedema, urticaria, bronchospasm, and the renal effects, which are adverse. Whereas when you inhibit the COX-2, which is the an inflammatory enzyme, then it exerts the beneficial effect. That will be the anti-inflammatory effect, the analgesic effect, and the antipyretic effect. So the non-selective NSAIDs is a double-edged sword, which has both adverse effects and the beneficial effects. Okay, next please. Now, the examples of non-selective enzymes are ibuprofen. It's given orally in a dose of 400 mg every 6 to 8 hours. The NNT is very good. It's 2. That means for every 2 persons, 1 person will get pain relief. Naproxen is another commonly used drug, which dose is 250 to 500 every 12 hours, orally or suppository. The NNT is again 2.7. That's also fairly good as compared to paracetamol. Next, please. Now, because it's inhibiting the COX-1 enzyme, which is a beneficial or the constitutive enzyme, which is necessary for our body function, it exerts its renal effects, its gastrointestinal effects, and causes hypersensitive reaction. So that is why we have to be very careful in these people when we are giving these non-selective NSAIDs. Next, please. So what are the risk factors for NSAIDs toxicity? People who are likely to get GI toxicity are those who have got history of peptic ulcer, history of upper GI bleed, those who are already taking aspirin, steroids, anticoagulants, they are likely to bleed. Okay. Now, the risk effects for renal toxicity are advanced age, where the renal function may be low, poorly controlled diabetes, patients who are dehydrated, those who are using already nephrotoxic drugs like beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, or diuretics, and those who already have a diminished creatinine clearance. So you have to be very careful when we're using NSAIDs, non-selective NSAIDs in these patients, even selective NSAIDs. Then, of course, there's a risk factor for stroke, and that is mainly with the COX-2 drugs. I'll talk about it later. So you have to be very careful when you're giving it in patients with diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, smoking, where they're likely to get atherosclerotic problems. So these patients are at risk for stroke and MI. Next, please. Now coming to the selective COX-2 inhibitors. That means they're only blocking the COX-2 and they're not blocking COX-1. So the beneficial effect on the body is retained and only the adverse effect is blocked. So the examples are etoricoxib, which is popularly called as mucoxia. It's a 60, 90, and 120 mg once a day dose. Or diclofenac is actually like a selective COX-2 inhibitor. It can be given orally or IV in a dose of 50 mg every 8 hours. Okay, its NNT is also very good. It is 2. Next, please. Now, topical NSAIDs are also available. You don't have to give it orally or IV. You can even give it by creams, gels, okay, or patches also. The examples are ibuprofen, diclofenac patch, you can have piroxicam and ketoprofen. So the advantage is it produces an analgesic effect with less risk of systemic absorption and systemic toxicity. Next, please. Now, are selective COX-2 inhibitors as safe as we think it to be? And is it safe compared to the non-selective NSAIDs or non-selective COX inhibitors? Well, that is true only where the GIT is concerned. So where the GIT is concerned, it can be safe as compared to the non-selective NSAIDs. But where the renal damage is concerned, it is as bad as the non-selective NSAIDs. So there is no advantage where the renal damage is concerned. On the other hand, its prothrombotic effects, like the risk of MI and stroke, are more with the selective COX inhibitors. So drugs like celecoxib, mucoxia, and all are likely to produce MI and stroke in high-risk people, like those with hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia. You have to be very careful when you use these drugs for that. In fact, one selective COX-2 inhibitor called rofecoxib was taken off the US market because of the incidence of these side effects. So in such patients, which is the COX inhibitor that you can give safely? That is ibuprofen and naproxen. They are can be given safely with people who are at risk for stroke and MI. Next, please. Next. Next.
Ma'am, 1 second. We are having some internet issues.
Okay. Drugs. Now let's move on to step 2 drugs. Now, step 2 drugs I mentioned are weak opioids. Now, weak opioid doesn't mean that they are controlled drugs. Like morphine and fentanyl and all are controlled drugs. That is, you cannot get it without a proper prescription. But as weak opioids can be got even with a regular prescription. So they are called not controlled. Okay, they're more easily accessible as compared to the strong opioids. So they are given for pain of moderate intensity, and that is not controlled with step 1 drugs. But sometimes you can skip step 2 and go directly to step 3. The examples that we are commonly using are tramadol and tapentadol. Next, please. So let's discuss tramadol. Now, both tramadol and tapentadol have a common way of action. They are both weak opioid agonists. And because they are weak, there is less tendency for respiratory depression and addiction potential as compared to morphine. Both act by blocking the presynaptic reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. That means the descending inhibitory pathway of pain, that is inhibiting the pain sensation, is actually being facilitated by the higher concentration of serotonin and norepinephrine. Both tapentadol and tramadol are acting in this way. So it's a common method of action. Now, because it is blocking the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, it can be useful in neuropathic pain. Okay, that is the advantage of this as compared to the other drugs. Now, it is where neuropathic pain is concerned, its NNT is 3.8. And we are commonly using a combination of tramadol with paracetamol for the relief of pain. It is like using the step 2 drugs actually. Next, please. So tramadol, the main advantage is got a high oral bioavailability, and the oral dose is 1/5 as potent as morphine. That means if you're giving 400 mg morphine, it's equivalent to 400 mg of tramadol is equivalent to 80 mg of morphine. But if you're giving it IV, it is 1/10 as potent as morphine. That means 400 mg of tramadol is 40 mg of morphine. Now, besides that, one, we need to know that even sustained release formulations are available, like it is called tramadol SR. So you need to give it only twice a day. So both 50 mg and 100 mg are available as sustained release formulation. Now, tapentadol. Next, please. So, like I said, the same thing. The method of action is the same. That's a weak opioid agonist and also inhibits the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. The dose is also more or less the same, 50 to 150 mg, up to 400 mg a day. Again, sustained release formulations are available in tapentadol. That is also another drug that can be given. Maybe its side effects are slightly better as compared to tramadol. Next, please. Now, coming to neuropathic pain. Now, cancer pain is not just nociceptive. They can be associated neuropathic pain. There could be bowel obstruction pain. There could be bone pain. There could be muscle spasm, pain due to muscle spasm, or there could be associated symptoms like lack of sleep causing pain, or anxiety and depression causing pain. Everything can cause pain. Okay, so that is why you're using the adjuvant drugs to treat the other components of cancer pain other than the nociceptive pain. Now, next, please. So what are adjuvant drugs? Adjuvant drugs actually are drugs, the primary indication is not pain, but they have analgesic properties. And they are co-administered with the drugs of the WHO ladder, and that is why it's called a co-analgesic. So it's also called co-analgesics. Okay. Next, please. So what are the types of adjuvant drugs? You have multi-purpose drugs. That means it's used for pain and also the other symptoms. And or you have specific adjuvant drugs that are given for specific types of pain. Like for neuropathic pain, you have some drugs. For bone pain, you have some drugs, adjuvant drugs. For musculoskeletal pain, you have certain drugs. For bowel obstruction pain, you have certain drugs. Whereas multi-purpose can be given for sedation, sleep, anxiety, or sometimes even for mood elevation and things like that. So they are the multi-purpose analgesic drugs. Next, please. So neuropathic pain. Now, neuropathic pain is caused by a disease or a lesion in the peripheral or the central nervous system. Because of that, the pain pathway becomes awry and the pain is sensed in a different way. It is not like nociceptive pain. Neuropathic pain has got its own characteristics. It has got a burning sensation. It can have a shooting and electric sensation. There can be tingling and numbness. Sometimes even without an injury, you can have pain. So that is a characteristics of a neuropathic pain. And the incidence is very high in cancer because of the nerve damage that is happening. So 40% of patients with cancer can have neuropathic pain. It can be even because of the chemotherapy that you can get in the cancer pain, or the radiotherapy, or the surgery where there's a nerve compression or a nerve is cut. All these are the causes why neuropathic pain occurs in cancer. Next, please. So what are the commonly used drugs for neuropathic pain? They are the anticonvulsants, antidepressants, even the step 3 drugs like morphine and step 2 drugs like tramadol can be used to treat neuropathic pain. Other than that, you can use local anesthetics, NMDA antagonists, corticosteroids, and GABA agonists also. Next, please. So there is a neuropathic pain ladder, just like the WHO pain ladder. So the step 1 is giving an antidepressant or an anti-epileptic. Step 2 is combining an antidepressant and an anti-epileptic. Step 3 is by giving an NMDA antagonist like ketamine. And step 4 is giving a local anesthetic like lignocaine. So this is how you go by that. So why are anticonvulsants used for neuropathic pain? That is because both in convulsion and in pain, there is a neuronal hyperexcitability. And these drugs act by dampening the neuronal excitability. And the drugs that are commonly used are gabapentin, pregabalin, sodium valproate, etc. Next, please. Now, how do they act? The gabapentinoids in neuropathic pain, they're actually binding to the calcium channel on the presynaptic unit and preventing the calcium influx into the presynaptic membrane. And when the calcium influx is inhibited, there is less release of the excitatory transmitter at the synapse. And because of this less release, there is less excitability of the postsynaptic membrane. So that is how they are acting. Both pregabalin and gabapentin are acting. Next, please. What are the advantages? That it has got very good effect in neuropathic pain, but the side effects of both are increased sleepiness, dizziness, impaired concentration, edema, weight gain, etc. Okay, that you have to be very careful when you're prescribing these drugs. Next, please. So the doses also has to be given very carefully, particularly in gabapentin. Start with small doses and go up. In pregabalin, the titration can be done in 2 to 3 steps. The main advantage of gabapentin is it's less expensive as compared to pregabalin, so it can be widely used. Next, please. Now, antidepressants are, like I said, also the first line treatment for neuropathic pain. So its analgesic action takes about 1 or 2 weeks for it to start. And this analgesic action is occurring at lower doses and earlier as compared to the antidepressant action. Okay. So for antidepressant, the doses are much higher as what you're giving for analgesia. So because of its antidepressant effect, many patients with cancer and chronic pain have got depression, anxiety, insomnia. So they are very useful in these kind of patients. So they also act by preventing the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin, and thus activating the descending inhibitory pathway of pain. Next, please. So the 3 types of antidepressants are tricyclic antidepressants. The commonly used ones are the amitriptyline and nortriptyline. Then you have SNRI, that is serotonin norepinephrine receptor inhibitor, duloxetine, milnacipran, etc. You also have a selective serotonin receptor inhibitor like SSRI or escitalopram, but that is useful especially when there is anxiety and depression. So it acts more when there is anxiety and depression as compared to just pain alone. Next, please. But the side effects of the TCA are that it causes CNS side effects like somnolence, drowsiness, mental clouding, and the other effect is because of its, next please, the anticholinergic effect or the antimuscarinic effect. So it all causes dry mouth. It can precipitate acute angle glaucoma, blurred vision, tachycardia, urinary retention, constipation, and orthostatic hypotension. So we have to be very careful when you prescribe it. Start with very low doses initially. Next, please. So these are the doses. I think I will skip it. You can see it later on. Okay. Next, please. So what are the other drugs in neuropathic pain? I told you about step 1, step 2. Now we go to step 3. That is NMDA antagonist. Ketamine. It's normally an anesthetic, but when you give in sub-anesthetic doses, it is very effective for neuropathic pain by inhibiting the NMDA antagonist receptor, N-methyl D-aspartate receptor. But it has got side effects. It can cause dysphoria, hallucinations, vomiting, and nausea. So to prevent these psychotomimetic effects, you have to give either haloperidol or you have to give a benzodiazepine so that they don't get hallucinations and delirium at all. And even for nausea, vomiting. Next, please. So, and like I said, it's given as sub-anesthetic doses. So the oral ketamine can be given at 10 to 25 mg TDS. It can be given as a subcutaneous IV infusion up to 50 to 100 mg per day. Also, there is what is called a burst ketamine dose or a pulse course of ketamine. It's given for intractable neuropathic pain, in which you start it as an infusion of 100 mg in 24 hours. You give it over 1 day. And if it is not effective, then only you go to 300 mg. And then again, you can go up to 500 mg. But normally you give it for a course of 3 days, 5 days. Now, local anesthetics also very effective. It acts by decreasing the neuronal excitability by blocking the sodium channels. So Xylocard can be given in a dose of 5 mg per kg. You give it over 1 hour. But you have to monitor the cardiac and the CNS problems of the toxicity. You have to carefully monitor them. It can be effective, and sometimes you can even use topical local anesthetic patches. 5% lignocaine patches are now available for certain types of neuropathic pain like post-herpetic neuralgia or certain localized pain. You can apply these lidocaine patches also. Next, please. Now, corticosteroids. It's a multi-purpose analgesic, adjuvant drug. That means it is not only good for pain, bone pain, neuropathic pain, headache because of a bone metastasis, arthralgia, obstruction of the gut, and even spinal metastasis. So it's given for a wide reason. That's why it's called a multi-purpose analgesic, adjuvant drug. So the commonly used drug is dexamethasone. Its main advantage is it has got less mineralocorticoid effects, so less chance of sodium and water retention. And it has a long duration of action. So you have to give it only once a day. But it can cause insomnia, so you have to give the steroids in the morning. That has to be remembered. Next, please. GABA agonists like baclofen can be given, particularly when there's a lot of spasticity. And so this also you have to give, starting with 10 mg, you can go upwards. Okay. Next, please. Bone pain. Bone pain is because of skeletal related events. And that's because of the metastasis that is happening. That can be very, very agonizing. It can really make a person miserable. So this has to be treated. And how do we treat it? Next, please. You can start with corticosteroids and NSAIDs because of its anti-inflammatory action. So it is good when there is multifocal bone pain. Or you can give calcitonin or Gemcal by either subcutaneous or intranasal, 200 units per day for 2 weeks. Or you can give bisphosphonates. Now, bisphosphonates and denosumab, they act by inhibiting the osteoclastic effect and stimulating the osteoblastic effect. The commonly used bisphosphonates is zoledronic acid. It's to be given once in 4 to 8 weeks. But it can cause some side effects like osteonecrosis of the jaw, which is a very bad side effect of zoledronic acid. So denosumab is another drug that is inhibiting the osteoclastic effect, but it's a human monoclonal antibody, but it is more expensive than the bisphosphonates, but it has got less side effects. But the disadvantage of denosumab is it cannot be used for prostate meds, but can be used for other meds. Or you can do palliative radiation, where targeted radiation is given to the bone metastasis. So you give it in those patients which are not responding to opioids and other drugs. You can give palliative radiation. Next, please. Pain due to bowel obstruction. That also can be very bad. It can be treated with steroids that decreases the edema in the bowel, or you can use a somatostatin analog like octreotide and anticholinergic drugs like hyoscine butyl bromide or glycopyrrolate. They act by decreasing the intraluminal secretions and decreasing the peristaltic movement. You can combine all three, steroids, octreotide, and anticholinergic drugs, particularly for very severe bowel obstruction pain. Next, please. Then you can use other drugs like skeletal muscle relaxants. They are like thiocolchicine, tizanidine, and chlorzoxazole, when there is a lot of muscle spasm along with the pain. Or if there's a patient is in delirium and agitation, you can use a neurolept like olanzapine. You may have to use antibiotic if there's an infection and pain, or sedatives if the patient is not getting any sleep, anxiolytic. Many of these patients are very anxious. You may have to allay the anxiety of these patients, because anxiety itself can increase the pain. Lack of sleep itself can increase pain. And even when they are very chronically constipated, you may have to add laxatives. So these are the other adjuvant drugs that you can use along with the WHO analgesic ladder. Next, please. To summarize, the WHO analgesic ladder is a sheet anchor for cancer pain management. And not only for cancer, it can even be given for non-cancer pain and for acute pain as well. The advantages is its simplicity and easy implementation. And so it has become a big success worldwide and even in the remotest corner of the world. And most importantly, it has legitimized the use of morphine in cancer and non-cancer pain. So the stigma associated with use of morphine has been decreased considerably. And not only the patients, but even the physicians are feeling more easy to prescribe drugs like morphine because the WHO itself has legitimized the use of this drug. That's it. Thank you. Rajalakshmi, I was in time today.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
That's okay.
Normally, I exceed the time.
So thank you, madam. And session is open for discussion. You can ask your doubts.
Hello,
Yeah.
this is Dr. Kale. Madam, you said dexamethasone is given once in 24 hours.
Yeah,
But
because
we,
its duration of action is 36 to 54 hours.
but commonly for ICP, raised intracranial pressure, and earlier it was used even it earlier.
Yeah, it can be used. Yeah, even we have used it. BD.
That's what I'm saying. Because I am of your age only. So I think I have used it way back in 77, 78. It was given routinely as 8 hourly.
But actually, if you look at the duration of action, it need to be given only once. Sunil, what are your inputs on this?
Yes,
Sunil?
madam. Yeah. So this is this is very common, and it is we have to understand that the biological half-life of dexamethasone is 36 to 54 hours.
Yes,
So
yes.
the steroids, especially if it is given at night, it will produce insomnia. In addition to the pituitary adrenal axis suppression. So in order to reduce those problems, it would be good if we can give the steroids as a single dose in the morning. And if needed, maybe by 2 p.m. And thereafter, we usually don't give. It is not a must, but these are some problem, insomnia and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis suppression. So that's why it is, and considering the long-acting nature of dexamethasone, we usually give as a single dose in the morning.
Thank you.
I'm a neuroanesthetist. So I've also done this, we've been giving it twice daily also, when in my practice I used to do it. But now I realize that maybe we don't have to do it.
Maybe we were wrong at that point of time. Maybe.
No, but then, always surgeons like to be extra careful, particularly where brain meds is concerned. So they may extra dose for their own comfort and
But presumably it was wrong. Anyway, the other question, madam, is you said in obstruction, the dexamethasone will reduce the edema. Okay,
Yes.
that's fine. But when it is an obstruction, and especially a malignant obstruction, it will be difficult to, because with just by putting this edema less, the problem is not solved. So even in palliative care, because I'm presently working with palliative team, the basic cause, if it is found, then it is better to get it relieved by some other type of intervention. Even though the patient is not very much fit for a major surgery, I would like to make some stomas. What is your take on that?
See, that would be the one that is maybe desirable, but there are some people who are not in a position for anything of that sort. So then in that, how do we reduce it? By reducing the secretions, reducing the edema, reducing the peristaltic movement. You can give some palliation of that. That is all.
Only for a day or two.
Yeah, I know that. But sometimes that itself cause some stool to pass and then relieve the obstruction. You never know. So I think these are for those people who can be taken up for any interventions.
So I would like to comment on that.
Sure. Yes.
Bowel obstruction in advanced malignancy, and it says steroids, dexamethasone in the range of 8 to 16 milligram is helpful to relieve the obstruction. So dexamethasone is one of the mainstay which is used in the treatment of patients with bowel obstruction in advanced malignancy. I agree that in patients who have good prognosis, then we should be able to refer the patient, as sir told, maybe if some surgical procedures are possible, we should refer the patient to.
A minimum for diverting colostomy has to be done, because ultimately after 2-3 days, that dexamethasone has it will not work, and the patient will be in agony, and there will be a lot of distension of the abdomen. I personally believe, taking a due risk also, you must do a diversion colostomy.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
That is true.
Because maybe that I am a surgeon, so I think in that way.
No, sir, you are right. No, if possible, we should refer the patient, but the patients
Yes.
who come to us, there will not be any scope of doing any surgery.
Yes, I understand. Right.
So
So these are
that's
my
the
doubts.
problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. So how many of you use gabapentin and pregabalin for treating neuropathic pain?
Hello. No, we are using gabapentin, not pregabalin. We are using gabapentin, but recently, even the last lecture by Dr. You were also there, I think. He had said, if I remember correctly, the claims by the people who are preparing gabapentin and advocating, they said the effects of gabapentin, which were earlier told, were not that much as was projected in the pharmaceutical industry. What is your take on that?
Yes, sir.
This was Dr. Rajgopal's version, not my version.
Yes, sir, I understand.
So what is your take?
Yeah,
Because personally, before palliative, I have come into palliative care for last 2 months. Before that, I was a surgeon, so I was not in palliative. I was in palliative surgery, not in palliative care. So there, we never used gabapentin.
Oh, okay.
What is your opinion on this, Rajgopal sir's opinion about gabapentin?
Yeah, it's not even Rajgopal sir's opinion, it's WHO's opinion. Because WHO in the latest guideline has said that gabapentinoids, that they have created some fraudulent evidence.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that was the thing they have mentioned.
Yes.
So we usually don't use gabapentinoids, and we have to understand that gabapentin and pregabalin are costly. And if we prescribe to the patient may come after 1 week and tell you that I have no pain relief, probably because they don't have money to buy it. So we don't understand that, and we will again increase the dose of gabapentin or add something. So that's also another thing that we have to keep in mind. Pharmacoeconomics is something which every one of us should understand.
Yes. Where I use a lot of gabapentin in my practice, even pregabalin, also gabapentin, but I'm talking of non-cancer pain, and I found it to be very effective. And a lot of my patients with chronic neuropathic pain, I'm using gabapentin combined with a antidepressant like NT or tryptamine, and I find it very effective for my patients.
Especially in which patient, madam?
Non-cancer pain, neuropathic non-cancer.
For example, any disease you mean?
For sciatica pain, for any neuropathic pain. It could be trigeminal neuropathy.
In pancreatitis, what do you use?
Pancreatic also, because there will be an element of neuropathic pain even in pancreatic.
Yes.
So even along with the other drugs, you may have to add an anti-neuropathic drug also. Then the treatment will be.
Personally, somehow gabapentin, I mean, I'm not using it, and I'm not very
use it regularly. I use it regularly.
That's what I'm talking of cancer pain only.
Even in cancer, I feel that it will benefit if you suspect a neuropathic element in it.
Okay, thank you.
That is why it is very important to differentiate between the nociceptive and neuropathic.
Yes, that's true. Thank you, ma'am.
Dr. Mary, Dr. Shaji have actually asked NNT and analgesics need explanation.
Okay. Numbers needed to treat, right? See, numbers needed to treat is determining the analgesic, efficacy of a particular analgesic, So that is, if you're giving if the number is 5, if the NNT is 5, that means for every 5 patients given paracetamol, only 1 has pain relief. Whereas if the NNT is 2, for every 2 people giving, 1 will have pain relief. So 2 will be definitely better than 5. So the lesser the NNT, the more efficacious the analgesic is. Whereas if the NNT is high, it means it is less effective as an analgesic. Is it clear now?
Thank you, madam.
Any other questions?
And for example, when you combine paracetamol with a brufen, its NNT will improve. From 5, it will become lesser, 2.7 or something like that. So by combining drugs, you can actually reduce the NNT also.
Madam, this sciatica pain is going to be a chronic condition. So how long can we prescribe this
Pardon me,
gabapentin?
No, can you tell that again? I didn't hear you.
Madam, that
Voice is breaking. Voice.
Right. So you can give up.
Dr. Arya, your voice is badly breaking. Can you give it in the chat?
Hello, am I audible now?
Yeah, it's audible now. Tell me.
Ma'am, this sciatica pain, that's going to be a chronic condition, right? So how long can we give gabapentin in such cases? Because every month they are going to come to see you and having this condition.
Can give it. Only thing, you make sure that you're not giving very high doses. Like you can, after some time,
Even if
taper
we
it
are
down.
starting with minimum dose like 100 mg.
You can give it. I've given it for 6 months, 1 year, no problem. In between, you monitor the renal and kidney function. Every 3 months or so, you monitor the kidney and renal function. But it's well tolerated, and some of my patients are on it for 6 months, 1 year, because when there are elderly people who are not going to undergo any definitive treatment, no, so they have to be on this medicine. So it can be in a minimum dose for a longer time, but monitoring the liver and kidney function.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, madam. With this gabapentin in this your sciatica or radiculopathy, does it reduce the edema?
It decreases the neuronal hyperexcitability.
Achha, only, but
How
doesn't
it is
reduce
acting? No, it doesn't.
Dr. Mary, we have a question in chat. What might be the best analgesic for osteoarthritis?
Okay. Now it depends on osteoarthritis. By the way, it is a mixed type of pain. I think that is now coming to the case discussion. So the case discussion is also on osteoarthritis. But I just want to tell that osteoarthritis is not just a nociceptive pain. It is a mixed pain. It has also got a neuropathic component in it. So the best drug would be a combination of a anti-nociceptive and an anti-neuropathic drug. Now, again, you have to see the age of the patient. Normally, osteoarthritis of the knee occur in elderly people. Okay, they may be having diabetes, they could be having impaired renal function. So how long can you give an NSAIDs in these patients? You have to be very careful when you're giving non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Ideally, that would have been better because it reduces the inflammation, but you can't give it for a long time, like 6 months, 3 months and all, you can't give it. So I would prefer to give a drug like a paracetamol along with an anti-neuropathic drug like gabapentin or pregabalin or one of the two. So you need to treat it because it is now considered to be a mixed pain, not just a nociceptive pain. And of course, drugs are not the only thing. When you're treating that, we'll discuss in that case when we're discussing that besides drugs, you have to look at other ways of treating the pain also. And drugs is not like a magic bullet that you can treat the pain of osteoarthritis. So it all depends upon the severity of the osteoarthritis, the age of the patient, the comorbidities of the patient, all that you have to consider when you're trying to choose a drug. But if you're for prolonged use, definitely NSAIDs is not the answer.
Madam, there are 3 more questions in the chat. How often do you find a dependence on gabapentin? That's one question. And how to manage edema in gabapentin? So those are 2 questions related to gabapentin.
So dependence on gabapentin, see, we can try to taper it off. If the patient is getting better and better, then maybe from, earlier he may be taking twice daily, you can make it once daily, then you can come down to a minimum of 100 mg daily at night. Okay, so you can come down to 100 mg. And if the patient, I have a patient who had a neuropathic pain, very severe neuropathic pain, but after his improvement, he has stopped all medicines. So it's not that you can be dependent on gabapentin. If the patient has recovered, you can even stop the gabapentin, or you can give a minimum basal dose of 100 mg at night. That's one. The second is edema due to gabapentin and pregabalin. There's no way of treating the edema. Weight gain and edema is something that happens, but by decreasing the dose, because I've seen people getting 150 BD of pregabalin. That's a very stiff dose, 300 mg, or 300 mg TDS of gabapentin. Those kind of doses can cause edema. So by coming down, maybe you can decrease edema. But that is one of the side effects of that. Then where trigeminal neuralgia is concerned, the anticonvulsant of choice would be carbamazepine and not gabapentin. Because for facial pains, carbamazepine and oxcarbamazepine are found to be more effective as compared to gabapentin. Okay. So they may be more effective in these kind of patients, trigeminal neuralgia and other facial pains. Then physiotherapy. Yes, physiotherapy is one of the mainstay for osteoarthritis. And physiotherapy, non-pharmacological methods should be incorporated to the pharmacological treatment when you're treating conditions like osteoarthritis. We can discuss that when we are discussing the thing. And rheumatoid arthritis, again, rheumatoid arthritis pain also can be very severe. So for this, I would not really give gabapentin and all, I'm not very confident of giving. I think you should stick to an analgesic, but there are other ways of treating the pain of rheumatoid arthritis by doing some type of steroid injection or a dry needling. When the pain is in the arm and all, you can do some dry needling and maybe steroid injections at a particular joint. Not very sure how effective gabapentin and pregabalin are for rheumatoid arthritis. I have no experience.
Madam, how long would you give carbamazepine or oxcarbazepine in trigeminal neuralgia?
All depends upon the patient. Because if the patient is responding to the treatment, then you have to come down to the minimum possible, because carbamazepine also has got a lot of side effects. It can reduce sodium, it can cause thrombosis, thrombotic events and things like that. So you need to reduce it. So initially you can start off, slowly go up and then again come down to a minimum level. But unless something is done for that, you may have to continue on some basal level. Otherwise, people are doing procedures to relieve that. Or even I do dry needling for relieving trigeminal neuralgia pain. If you're doing that and the patient is getting relief, you can come down on the dose of your carbamazepine. And if there is a neuropathic element to the thing, which is often present, you can even add an antidepressant also. Like sometimes they complain of burning pain and allodynia. That means there is a neuropathic component also to the trigeminal neuralgia. Then they will respond when you add a nortriptyline or a tryptomer also. I'm also doing dry needling for trigeminal neuralgia. We needle the muscles around the nerve.
Okay. Thank you, madam. I think we can.
What is dry needling?
Yeah. You can speak.
Dry needling is basically we use acupuncture needles, but it is not acupuncture. So we are doing that because whenever there is pain, there is a muscle spasm. Muscle spasm leads to shortening because the contraction is happening, relaxation is not happening. So when you dry needle the muscle, that is by putting these needles and leaving it there for half an hour, you actually relax the muscles. And depending upon where you're doing the needling, you can do it for the back, you can do it for the neck, shoulder, you can treat tennis elbow, you can treat sciatica, you can treat myofascial pains with dry needling. So depending on that, even fibromyalgia also we can treat with dry needling, where the tender points can be needled. You leave the needles and leave it for half an hour. So it acts by, one is by relaxation, but it is also supposed to increase serotonin levels. And so there are other ways by which dry needling also acts. And I find it a very, very useful tool in my pain management. And I'm routinely doing dry needling for a big variety of patients.
Yes,
You can look up on my website. I have a website, treatingpain.in. In that, you'll find all about dry needling also, in case you're interested. Treatingpain.in without a space, all small letters.
Is neurobiome tablet useful in neuropathy? Another question.
Definitely. See, a lot of people are having B12 deficiency. So it is very important that most patients, I check their D3 and B12 levels. If it is low, definitely neurobiome will be helpful by giving a methylcobalamin. And if the D3 is low, because D3 is like a pandemic. Many patients are having D3 low. Even many people are having low B12. So the logical way to do it is to check the levels. If that is low, then you give it, but blindly giving it, because some people have got high levels of B12. So those who have high levels, there's no point in giving. You may cause, too much of those levels, which is not good. So it's better to check the levels and then treat it. I would say that will be better.
Yeah, we have shared the website address of Dr. Mary's website in the WhatsApp group. Thank you. I think we will move on to patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Vasudha. Dr. Vasudha, can you hear us?
Can you
sorry, please unmute yourself. No, you are muted. Please unmute.
No, doctor, we can't hear you.
You have logged in from 2 devices. No.
Side since 6 months. There is morning stiffness, which is brief. There's difficulty in walking and climbing stairs since 3 years. There is difficulty in squatting. There's intermittent swelling over the joint. Patient also has constipation off and on since 2 years. And there is a creaking sound on walking. Next, please. The history of present illness is the patient has intermittent pain in both the knee joints since 8 years, more pain in right knee joint since 1 month. There is decreased range of motion. Pain is activity related and worse throughout the day. It is diffuse and aching type of pain. Morning stiffness is there but brief, and there is no history of diabetes, only hypertension which is mild and controlled on drugs. Next, please. On examination, the swelling is more on right side, right knee joint. There is a valgus deformity. Gait is antalgic. Medial joint line tenderness is there, more on right side. There is restricted range of movement with bony resistance in passive flexion. And on palpation, crepitus is there. On VAS scale, the pain is 7 on 10. Next, please. In significant investigations, the routine investigations normal. I had done CRP, which were normal. Even uric acid was normal. Then X-ray, radiological investigation, X-ray standing and AP and lateral I had already displayed on my previous slide. The patient was very poor, so she was not affording MRI or any other investigations. On treatment, baseline treatment, I had given her a hinged kneecap, which she was using with some medications, which I will later on in the next slide, I will tell. Then I had suggested her knee replacement and high tibial osteotomy, but patient could not afford. Then we went with genicular RF and knee joint PRP, which I will discuss in the last slide. Now the psychosocial aspect of this is that the patient is 70, the husband is alive. She lives with her son, who is a farmer. Daughter-in-law also works in farm. She's spiritual, but can't visit the temple frequently as before because of her difficulty in walking. She is also finding difficulty in doing daily activities, including her rituals. She can't look after her husband as before. Next, please. The medications, what we gave was tablet Zerodol, again NSAID, then Neuraceutical, BID, then vitamin D3 once a week, then local ointment, which contains NSAID and muscle relaxant twice a day, and calcium supplement. Next, please. The main concern is that, is this a life-threatening illness? How long this dependency and agony will last? There is no money for knee replacement. And what else can be done to reduce the pain? Next, please. The summary is, she is a 78 years female, bilateral osteoarthritis knee joint with valgus deformity on right side, pain and stiffness while walking, cannot afford knee replacement surgery or any other surgery, and of course, intermittent constipation and anxiety. That was dealt, I mean, Difalac was given intermittently to her. Next, please. Now, the point to be discussed, which I felt was, what else can be done to reduce the pain? What can be done so she can do daily activity with little aids? Financial support regarding surgery from the government and private organizations, psychological counseling of the patient, and counseling of the family members. In this case, I had given genicular nerve RF on the right knee along with PRP. This only that much we could do. And now she has applied for PM's fund for TKR. Next, please.
Okay, thank you, madam. So the this story is open for discussion. Anybody can comment on this. You can give your opinion.
Sir, physiotherapy will help her.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
She was already on physiotherapy. She was already on physiotherapy.
You didn't mention that. Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Dr. Joseph Daniel. Dr. Joseph Daniel is an orthopedician, and we will hear from him. What is his opinion?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, from an orthopedic point of view, this is a clear-cut case. Also, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
There's no role of waiting in this case anymore. It's a case of severe end-stage osteoarthritis with tri-compartment.
Okay. Sir, you are not very much audible now.
She's only going to get progress. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can
Hello?
hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes, sorry. So it is valgus knee going progressively into more and more valgus. Joint surface is completely lost. There's no role for non-operative treatment in this case at all. Right now also the TKR, they may have to use a what we call as a constrained knee, because the increasing valgus would have already made the ligaments unstable, collateral ligaments. So waiting any longer is no use in this case. The only pathway that these patients take is they find that nothing helps except for anti-inflammatories. They go on to increasing doses of anti-inflammatories and destroy their kidneys and liver and everything, stroke and every other risk. So from our point of view, it is clearly a surgical case. Physiotherapy won't help. Analgesics, they'll have to keep taking increasing doses. Quality of life will be lost. And the best thing is to find funding somehow and go to a specialist who does unstable knees and get a knee replacement.
Okay, so there are some comments in the chat. Walker use for the time being, valgus correcting braces. Dr. Joseph Daniel, can you comment on this valgus correcting braces?
Yeah, they are all effective when there is still some joint space left and it's not end stage arthritis. Say, for instance, we grade it into 4 grades. If it is grade 2 or grade 3 osteoarthritis where there is some cartilage, any of these supportive measures will help. But this is a case where the articular cartilage is lost in all 3 compartments and almost totally lost. So in this case, it is surgery only.
Okay. So is this covered under Ayushman Yojana? Do you have any idea? Ayushman Bharat, isn't it? Ayushman Bharat insurance.
I'm not familiar with
Okay. That is, it's PMJY, Pradhan Mantri, it's something, PMJY is the short form of that. PMJY is.
Yeah. But I think we can discuss what we would do if it was not that severe arthritis and progressively unstable knee. Then what would we do? I mean, what are the pharmaceutical alternatives and all that? If it had been less severe arthritis and a more stable knee. So, I mean, I'm open to listening to what options there would be. All of these, physiotherapy and analgesics, anti-inflammatories, all of these would come into play.
Yeah.
So probably we could discuss that. And sorry for interrupting too early and making that comment.
Okay. So I'm sure all of you have seen patients with osteoarthritis and all of you have prescribed. So all of you will have opinion on this patient. And there are many opinion already in the chat. And if there is anybody want to give any more opinion regarding this?
I wanted to know whether did she get any relief from the radio frequency genicular RF, Dr. Vasudha? You gave the.
Can you unmute yourself? Madam, please unmute yourself and speak. No, still not audible, madam. Yeah. Can you speak now?
She was relieved.
Okay, so that's a good thing.
Yes. That was a palliative thing which we could do, madam.
Yeah, I know that. I know. It was like just mentioned by our orthopedic friend that in such a case, grade 4 the surgery is the one option because she's already she's already got a lot of deformity and
Yes, yes,
unstable
yes.
knee. Surgery was the best option, but then since
Best
it
option.
could not be done and you produce relief with this, I think that's a
Yes.
good thing that we have done.
Yes,
that.
yes.
Okay.
And someone asked about the role of dry needling in this. I think there was in the chat. I
I saw that. Madam, can you talk about the role of dry needling in this patient?
One thing I can make out is that passive flexion also was not possible. It was restricted. It could be because of the bony deformity. It also could be because of a quadriceps spasm. So there, as an adjunct, as a supplemental treatment, you can do dry needling of all the muscles around the knee, which includes the quadriceps, the calves, and the hamstrings. So there, like a multimodal treatment, you have done the RF. In case she cannot go in for a knee replacement, you can add dry needling to the various modalities that's being done. Because that could really, because there will be a lot of spasm of these muscles, the quadriceps, the hams, particularly the quadriceps. So you can do dry needling of these muscles.
Madam, which needle you use for dry needling?
Basically, acupuncture needles of various sizes, starting from 25 mm to 40 mm to 75 mm. So they are so fine, they are about 35 gauge needles, very fine, just like acupuncture needles. But only thing we don't do acupuncture, we are doing dry needling with that. That's
okay.
Can you use any other analgesics for this patient?
Yeah, because I saw that she's on Zerodol, aceclofenac.
Yeah.
How long can you give these NSAIDs for an elderly lady over 80 years? So we may have to come down on that and give something else, paracetamol based. I don't know, it has no anti-inflammatory effect, I know, but considering that it may damage her kidneys, we may have to switch over to some other analgesic also in the long run.
So maybe paracetamol would be an option, and in exacerbation, use anti-inflammatory for a short course, considering the broad side effects. There are many side effects of NSAIDs. And what else can we give opioids and see what is the response if there is no proper relief with paracetamol?
You're asking me, Sunil?
Yes.
I don't think opioids is an answer. Particularly for non-cancer pain, I think we should be very careful using this.
Yeah,
I don't know how much it will be. I've never, I don't know how much opioids will be. I mean, I'm not, I don't know.
Madam, tramadol and paracetamol.
Tramadol is another option, maybe, because tramadol can also take care of neuropathic pain. And since this is a mixed pain, you may have to add something with a neuropathic effect also. But I'm not very sure about morphine, the use of morphine for treating osteoarthritis.
Yeah. If the patient does not have pain relief with paracetamol, and this patient is lucky to see Dr. Vasudha, because she could get pain relief with the pain intervention. But I think most of the patients will not be so much lucky to have a pain procedure. So I think if there is no proper pain relief, I think we have to see what else could work in this situation. And maybe as Madam told, in non-cancer pain, whenever we start opioids, we should be very careful. But at the same time, it's our duty to give comfort for the patient. So we have to have a balance here, and maybe we can start on weak opioids and see whether it gives her pain relief so that it can improve her quality of life. Because this patient is unable to afford total knee replacement, and we don't know when it is going to happen. So we cannot make her to suffer till then. So we have to do something for this patient to at least have some pain relief. We may not be able to give full pain relief, but we can always see whether we are able to give satisfactory pain relief.
We can also consider some non-pharmacological options like a walker or applying ice and using braces for the knee. I mean, we must, everything together, non-pharmacological options also should be factored into the treatment.
Okay. So I think Dr. Vaibhav, counseling the patient and family is important. Basic precaution at home, like avoid sitting on the floor, etc., as it is a progressive thing. Regular physiotherapy and round-the-clock pain management. Dry needling can be given so that she can do some basic daily activities which can boost up her morale till the time she gets her total knee replacement surgery done. Her family members must be counseled regarding the same. Yeah, Dr. Vaibhav says Ultraset. So which is a combination of tramadol and paracetamol. It's Dr. Vasudha. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, madam. Thank you, everyone.
So yeah, somebody is going to speak. Anybody want to give their opinion? So how can we provide financial support? What are the financial support available? So I think here comes
PM
the role
fund
of,
is
yeah, yes,
PM
madam.
fund is there, which you have to apply, and then it takes almost 2 months to work out. So
But-
from PM fund, we had actually the patient is trying through that PM fund only.
Will it be able to meet the expense of total knee replacement, or from this fund will they give only a small amount of money?
Ma'am, you are muted.
It is 70,000 to 1 lakh.
Yeah.
That is not sufficient. Actually, it needs more sometimes. Depends upon the implant which you are using.
Okay, is it a RFP-wise scheme that you are talking?
No, there is a separate, actually in Maharashtra, in some hospitals, government hospitals, the scheme is there.
Okay.
I am working in an institute where that scheme is not there for TKR.
Okay.
Yes. So Pradhan Mantri Yojana,
Yeah.
Madad Yojana, it's like that. So you have to specially apply. It takes approval for 1 to 2 months, maybe 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe if I don't know whether is it possible to find out some sponsors.
Yes. That must be tried.
Madam, do you have any more ideas? Mary,
Me?
madam. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Vaibhav says NGOs can help by raising funds for her. Yeah. So these all are can be tried.
Yes, can be tried.
Government is helping in him. Dr. Vinakaran Sharma, can you explain what you mean?
Yes, sir. Government is helping in Him Care Yojana, our state government in Himachal. And Ayushman Bharat is also helping
Okay, okay, yeah,
for these things.
yeah. Thank you,
Okay, sir.
thank you. So
Okay, sir.
psychological counseling and counseling of the family members is important. Dr. Vaibhav already talked about that. So is there any specific point that anybody would like to mention regarding the counseling of the patient and family?
Difficult for counseling.
Sorry? Anybody else want to contribute any more points? Okay, Dr. Anita Chandana says, explain that she would recover fully and be off medication. So probably after total knee replacement. Yeah. And Dr. Vaibhav also says, as her pain might make her feel it is life-threatening. Okay. Yeah. So basically, we have to talk to the patient and find out her concerns and explain what is meant by total knee replacement and what would be done and what would be the prognosis, what would be the result after total knee replacement. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam, any
Yes.
more
Ah,
points?
yes.
Yeah, I think so. Reassurance is very important. We need
Yes,
to
ma'am.
reassure them that, see, anyway, she's got some relief with the treatment that was given. And then we can reassure her that we will try to do further things. I think reassurance is a very important thing. And, listening not just to the physical pain, but like in total pain, we should listen completely. This lady has got physical pain, emotional pain, social pain also, because of the financial concerns and so many other things. They are farmers. So all those have to be taken into treatment and not just treat her physical pain. There are so many dimensions of a pain. Everything should be taken care of when we counsel them.
Yeah, thank you, madam, for those points. Because we usually tend to look at physical pain, but this elderly lady has many other problems that we have to also look into. Otherwise, addressing the physical problems alone will not give much relief of her pain. So it is important to address, it is important to talk to her, find out her problems, other problems, and then if possible also address it. Otherwise, just listen to her. That's also important.
Important. Active listening is very, very important.
So I think we can wind up the session for today. So thank you, Mary Madam, for being with us. And